And a Ponzi scheme.
And the Ponzi
You're
scheme.
basically asking the question, is crypto a Ponzi scheme? Let's address that.
I'm asking what's the utility side that means it's not a Ponzi scheme?
Really good. Let's go.
Started during lockdown, needed something to do. They looked at each other, they said, hey, I like talking to you. And so from a garden shed in a box room in West London, they're discussing tech. It's the Small Time Bets podcast.
Where are we?
Jonathan, we're in the Waterloo New Brewdog, which is the largest ever Brewdog venue. It's got
Duck pin bowling, I'm looking at.
yeah, there's a
Little
slide, that like a helter-skelter slide you can go down. There's an ice cream van for desserts.
There's a coffee thing. It's really cool.
Grind coffee, so that's really good.
But in-house.
And there's also a secret speakeasy-style cocktail bar.
We need to explore that later.
And there's some podcasting studios.
I'm going to grill you a little bit about food production.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to these. I'm just going to see what your thoughts are. So I titled this Meeting Climate Change Head On, pun intended. It's a weird situation at the moment where everyone's talking about a global food crisis, which it seems is looming. Inflation is affecting a lot of basic consumer goods that we take for granted. So, and then weirdly enough, there's also the situation where in the US and in the West generally, there's an obesity crisis. So there's kind of a weird parallel of two sides of the world where we produce twice the calories that we need as a planet to keep everyone fully fed. But yeah, some people are getting really fat. Some people are in absolute famine. There's a food crisis looming. And at the same time, everyone is worried about climate change and not just the effect that has on every other part of our life, but also the effect that has on agriculture. So I wanted to know your thoughts just on that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of food waste as well.
And food waste, yeah. Which, well, in some parts of the world, there's, like I said, there's a split depending on which part of the world you look at, where there's lots of food waste, lots of obesity, lots of health problems related to that. And then on the other side, there's literally a person dying every minute in Nigeria of famine.
And it's kind of like the global north, where, of course, with obesity, the paradox is that often it's the cheaper, more highly processed foods in one's diet that can lead to greater obesity. So it's not like we're saying that obesity is a sign of great plenty. Even in the affluent societies, obesity is correlated to lower socioeconomic situations. I guess it already hit home with the energy and food costs rising with the Ukraine crisis, because we noticed that suddenly the breadbasket of Eastern Europe, where a lot of the grain is coming from, and a lot of the phosphate to make fertilizer, is Ukraine and Russia. And then when you take a lot of that supply out, it turned out that I think there's only 3 months worth of supplies in terms of grain storage. So the whole of the world is running on 3 months worth of spare capacity. If at any point grain just stops, we've got 3 months worth in backlog.
I never ever understood that stat, because surely it's annual and seasonal. So we would have at least the winter season of storage, which is more than 3 months. I don't know, maybe I'm just not close enough to it. But then again, before the Ukraine war, I didn't really realize how much grain and wheat, sunflower oil as well, that comes from Russia and Ukraine. So 60% of the global supply of sunflower oil comes from Russia and Ukraine. And sunflower oil is kind of the essential. But one of the things that I've started to think quite heavily about is, obviously there's a lot of things that we're trying to do to alleviate the long-term impacts of climate change. I still think intensive agriculture, meat production, food transportation, food waste are huge contributors to the climate crisis. But likewise, like, we have a food crisis now, So I don't know how to balance them. And I was just thinking, what do you think about things like, I'm just going to list a few things and you can react to them how you want to, but like domestic agricultural subsidies, the concept of more people going vegetarian or vegan or reducing meat consumption versus plant-based meat substitutes, the future of lab-grown meat and or precision fermentation to produce food in other methods, and even industrialized vertical greenhouses where they're pumping in CO2 to try and almost make a factory farm rather than large land usage. Anyway, I'll stop there, but there's a whole load of concepts there, and I don't know what your thoughts on them are.
Yeah, so as we head into a horrible winter in Europe with gas supplies down, gas prices really high, and a lot of people at risk of energy poverty, where they can't really heat their homes and they have to choose between food that they don't need to cook versus, they're making choices about eating or heating, and they're making choices about not being able to afford the petrol, gasoline that they need to get to work, to earn more money to pay their heating bills. That's the kind of situation that's even affecting kind of the wealthy countries of Europe. And in that context, it's a weird one because you look at the choices that we're facing about, all right, so farming is very water intensive and it feels topical because this summer has had the rainfall across the US and all of Europe, and that's had a lot of knock-on effects. So we're going to be looking at more water shortages as the decade progresses. Then we've got everything we're trying to do about climate. At the same time, it's very real and it's a real global effort that's going to be required, but it doesn't feel as urgent to a lot of people as keeping the lights on and keeping the heating on. And then you talk about food production, and we know that agriculture is one of the big contributors to methane, which is sulfur greenhouse gas. So if we were able to take a lot of meat out of the system of global industrial food production, we could really help reduce greenhouse gases. It almost feels like, and I don't want to come across as, using the kind of Trump rhetoric, but it almost feels as if there's two conversations happening globally. One at Davos, where people think about really nice things, that, aspirational stuff around really reducing greenhouse gases and making sure that hard to abate sectors are decarbonized as quickly as possible. And everything's about environmental and social governance directives. And then the other conversation that's going on where people are really struggling to get by. 90% of the people are really struggling to get by. We've got fuel poverty, food poverty.
Are you just talking about the West and Northern Hemisphere, or are you talking about
I think globally, if you looked
the
at
globe?
Yeah, globally, if you looked at what is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs thing that's most weighing on your mind right now, today, a lot of people would say, well, I'm a bit worried about what we're going to be doing in the winter.
But when people talk about the global North, I think a lot of people, it's people like us who live in like Western democracies. That's really what they mean. They mean like Europe and North America. They don't mean China when they say the global North. That's kind of separate. They probably don't mean India, even though most of it actually sits above the equator. What they mean is actually Europe and North America, which is why I'm thinking there's a weird situation where like the whole world is so connected. The climate is a connected system, and that leads to and climate change itself is impacting food production on a global scale, right? Whether it's lack of rainfall causing droughts or floods, washing away people's livelihoods. I think they're all quite related, but I'm getting really confused because although there's kind of political, not stalemate, there's an absence of any political action happening in the UK. That's a separate thing. But people ought to be thinking about what are the big ticket items for the future. And one of them is climate change. One of them is food production. And they're so interrelated. I just don't know how to break them down in a really easy way. People like simple solutions to big problems. There often aren't many. Like, is it that we should all go vegan? Is it that you should only buy local seasonal things from local shops that are sourced in your country to stop the massive global trade and reliance on other countries providing that? Is it that we should all eat a bit less? Or is it that we should be investing all our time and money and energy into, vertical industrial greenhouses and lab-grown meat? I don't know.
Yeah. Do you have a view?
I don't know. Part of me is thinking long term, what the Netherlands have done when it comes to, Netherlands is the biggest producer of fruit and veg in Europe. And you're just like, huh? They're a tiny country with actually very small landmass, and yet they are producing so much fruit and veg because they're just so much more advanced than everyone else. What we produce in what we'd need big farmland for, they're doing in these really amazing, have you seen these like warehouses where the tomatoes kind of are grown at the top and then the vine grows down, like vining tomatoes, and then they almost like wheel up on a big wheel, wind up the vine, so that as it's growing, they're plucking them and then they're just vining it up, and it's all fed at the top through a very, like an not what it's called, hydroponic mix. So it's no soil, they're and then they're pumping these essentially giant greenhouses with excess CO2 to beef up the tomatoes.
Oh, cool.
And then they're able to, add 50% of yield by adding in CO2, reduce water consumption by like 90%, reduce the need for a lot of, fertilizers, pesticides, all of that stuff, because it's all done industrially. It's not great for it's got nothing to do with soil health because you've got no soil, but in terms of feeding people, that's very efficient. And I think things like that might be, they might be options we need to look at. Yeah, in the UK, in other countries where we're kind of addicted to subsidizing agriculture just to keep things, the status quo going, we should really be shifting the model completely to this kind of industrial, futuristic food production. And then in other parts of the world where you've got precision fermentation, you could produce proteins and fats and oils and things that you need, like the raw ingredients of food, at scale with waste products, with solar energy, for instance, as the main power, which you have in like the global south and equatorial regions in abundance, but you don't have a lot of food, and we're running out of things like, arable farming land. I just think those are the sort of conversations we need to have. And at the moment, I don't think anyone's having that because everyone's panicking about inflation and like the very near term, what happens in winter. Longer term, it's going to be a very different story.
Yeah, I've got a few reflections. I think one of the things that people don't like is when the government tells them what they should and shouldn't be eating. But tastes change and prices drive tastes changing as well. It's been really surprising to me to see over the last 5 to 10 years the rise of veganism, how fast it grew.
Is it still growing? I feel like last year, maybe 2 years, it peaked around the time of Game Changers on Netflix. Everyone did a month of being vegan and then veganuary. But all the vegan food stocks or plant-based food stocks have all collapsed recently because demand is, I don't know, I thought demand had peaked.
So, I mean, we're right to say that there's an environmental imperative. There is a moral imperative. And look at industrial meat production. I think when people look back on this time, they will say, well, that was an absolute horror show. The slaughterhouses, the scale of production, the life of the animals that was basically totally instrumentalized, and they
were just pushed through vegan, though.
Pushed through this system.
You could just go free range. But there are ethical ways.
I don't think that we can produce as much meat as we're currently consuming in a way that's consistent with being completely morally at peace with ourselves. Just my view.
No, I agree.
So there's that imperative. And, tastes will change, and we'll get to a point where maybe we go back to eating meat just once a week, like it was in the UK in the 1940s and 50s, where meat was a very special thing, which cost a lot of money, and you'd have it on a Sunday as part of your roast. That seems more consistent with what eating actually is, which is taking the life of another animal on the planet.
If that happens for like the billion people you're referring to, what about China and India? They make up what, a third of the planet population wise, and everyone is shifting very quickly to a meat diet because it's become, like you said, like we've found ways of mass feeding and slaughtering animals. How do you feed that habit and that trend?
Yeah, so where I was going with this was to say that on the one hand, you don't want governments to tell you what you can and can't eat, but the kind of levers that we have is people's tastes shift and change, and part of that is for moral reasons, and actually that feels like a good outcome. It's also really great for the planet, and it will partly be driven by the increasing price of everything that meat production involves. So the phosphates, the fertilizers, and the massive amount of energy and water. And people will potentially shift towards the cheaper lab-grown alternatives for protein and for carbohydrates.
When those become cheaper.
Which are currently those are quite expensive.
They're all very expensive. But if we've learned anything from mass production of everything else, wouldn't you basically apply, lean manufacturing to something like growing meat? I think we'll get it down to very, very cheap, efficient scales. It just takes time, right?
So is your vision of the future, you're in the Matrix, you're eating a grey, textureless gruel, and you just kind of have to imagine that it's a delicious steak?
What, am I Cypher? Or am I, which character? No, I think I actually am quite keen on the idea of lab-grown meats. I think there's a lot we can do there. But I'm thinking... at the moment, that's kind of a niche fringe thing, liking the idea of being able to make custom grown healthy meat alternatives really cheap, like out of real meat, is actually, that's kind of a very futuristic take on it. Whereas the basic thing right now is like rice or wheat or, just really basic food products, vegetables that you can actually eat, growing them cheaply, efficiently, at scale, locally as well, so you're not shipping everything everywhere, needs to happen. And I don't know, are you familiar with like the ABCD?
The alphabet. Yes.
Are you familiar with the four companies that control around 80 to 90% of global food
Tell me more.
trade? So ABCD, which is ADM, Bunge, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus basically control around 80 to 90% of food trade and production. And, that's the way the planet is run at the moment. But there is an interesting argument of like, how much can you shift production to be more local and domestic, take it out of the like massive conglomerates that are producing it, fair enough, and investing a lot in it and shipping it all around the world, and make it locally sourced, grown, and delivered, so that we're just cutting out the system that we have at the moment, which is generally growing it in like poorer parts of the world where they actually don't have enough food locally, and then we're shipping it to Western parts of the world where we just waste it. There's a weird...
And the cost of that is monoculture of production. So much less biodiversity. The cost of that is soil gets depleted in its richness. And the benefit, the huge upside of that, is that food is incredibly cheap.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that we haven't really spoken about is, and you touched on it earlier, is massive subsidies of, for example, corn is incredibly cheap in the US because it's hugely subsidized. The point at which corn syrup is in everything, and it feels like everything, even building materials, just seem to have corn in them. Corn is everywhere because it's so cheap. And decades of lobbying and subsidies will do that to an economy.
And dairy, right? And even in the UK, in fact, I think everywhere dairy is subsidized. Dairy is a weird thing. Milk should not be cheaper than water. like getting milk,
Mm.
where you're putting water in a cow,
Yeah.
and then it's producing milk, and then you're pasteurizing it and shipping it. Should not be cheaper
I mean,
than
it's
getting
actually a
water out of the
great-
ground. It
it's-
just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, logically, from first principles, the things you're saying are correct. I actually like it as an outcome because nutritionally, it's fantastic that you can go into McDonald's and it's possible to get milk for less than a comparable bottle of
But-
water.
I mean, you're familiar with like the whole government cheese situation. Was that the Reagan administration
Government cheese.
in? Was that the Reagan administration in the US?
Yes, Cheesegate.
Cheesecake.
I don't know what you're talking about.
You don't know government cheese?
cheese. No, government cheese.
Massive subsidies of cheese in the US to kind of bolster and save their farming industry led to the government having to mass buy all the excess milk that was being produced because it was so heavily subsidized and there just wasn't enough demand for it. So they had the Got Milk adverts on
Oh, yeah.
TV, and everyone was like, you got to have milk. You should have milk with everything, your cereal, your tea, your coffee, whatever. And then the only way to store milk, because you can't really freeze it, you end up having to turn it into cheese. And so they built these massive caverns underground where the government would buy milk, turn it into cheese, and send it to people free. So cheese was almost like a subsidy for people on food stamps and people who were on welfare. You just got like government cheese sent to you, and then any excess they store underground in these big humidity managed caverns, and they still have loads. They still have loads of government cheese. It kind of tastes like cheap mild cheddar.
This has been a fascinating.
You didn't know about this?
No,
this
I
is-
don't even know. This is worse than a rabbit hole. It's a cheese hole.
No, this is Google it, government cheese. It is
Yeah.
it's a crazy thing when you think about it, because you're just like, that's the
But cheese
problem.
doesn't
Of,
even keep that long.
it does. Like it does because it has the rind around it, and it's like big vats, and it's controlled in deep, deep caverns.
Amazing.
But then the UK, I think, has its own subsidies on farming and on dairy, and the whole thing is just mad. But it's weirdly competitive in the sense that it's kind of a national security thing to make sure you've got food security domestically of those type of things. So they subsidize it to make sure that it doesn't, market forces don't drive it overseas. But then the counter to that is you get these stupid situations where like milk's cheaper than water, or you've got caverns full of cheese, or you've got situations where the real beneficiaries are probably the ABCD corporations and then shareholders, and actually the people getting marginalized is like everyone else who wants, better quality farming with better investment, not just subsidies, but actually, more futuristic farming, and parts of the world who are starving, who are being subjected to not just climate change, but also famine. There's a lot there. I haven't unpacked it very well, but
Just as a reflection, and one of the things that I've noticed, particularly from a Japanese standpoint, is that food gets invested with a lot of meaning. So food is obviously something we need just to keep going and survive, but food is about people coming together. It's a cultural event. Some of it is ceremonial and some of it's symbolic. And I get how we could go lab grown and massive vats of the stuff for the staples, the carbohydrates, the quinoa, the rice, the grain, the buckwheat, what have you. The substitutes for that or that themselves, and really drive down the cost. I can also imagine that food over time, the symbolic food is going to be invested with a lot more meaning, and we end up paying higher prices for that because it's grown locally. It comes with a story. The whole farm to table movement is all about, tell me about the life of this chicken. Tell me about its personality. And taking individual items of produce, packaging them up as a beautiful thing, and then being more mindful about consuming them. I can't get away from the fact that eating meat means something. It's an aggressive act, and it means celebration and victory because of where we've come from. So we are animals who predate as apex predators. And when we're having a meat dish, eating cow feels like a win, and it feels like a celebration. But it's so bound up in everything that our culture is, which is aggressive and destructive. So getting to a place where we're doing less of that could be a good thing semiotically as well as for the environment and morally.
Yeah, I agree. But I also would say that, like most people, and especially the youngest generation, don't think of food in that way. They think food is born in a fridge or born in a supermarket, not grown as a car that then has to live like 10 years and then eventually is slaughtered brutally and then chopped up and then packaged and shipped around the world. They don't think of it like that. It's which is why it's good, I think for kids to do a bit of farming, even if it's in your garden, just growing things and understanding where that comes from is actually quite a good thing. We should move on. This is a very deep topic, but hopefully, yes. Has that answered any questions of mine? No, it's just given me more food for thought.
Nice. I see what you did there. Jonathan, I think it's time for this week's Not a Sponsor.
Go on, hit me with it.
This week's Not a Sponsor is Brewdog Waterloo's podcasting venue, where you can record podcasts and even with video. And that it's unexpected to see in what is essentially a bar, a professional podcasting studio. But here we are, recording today next to the bowling. That's Brewdog Waterloo, the largest Brewdog venue so far. And that's this week's Not a Sponsor. Today also happens to be in Scotland, the day that a group of cyclists and mountain bikers are joining some Brewdog employees to bike through acres of land which is known as the Lost Forest, where Brewdog is planting an entire 9,000 acre plus new forest from scratch.
I need you to tell me a little bit about This Week in Crypto.
So, Jonathan, yes, it's time for This Week in Crypto on the markets. So the big news in the markets was this week we had Jackson Hole, so Fed chairman,
skiing venue.
Fed Chairman Jerome Powell said that it's time to keep at it. So he said it's time to keep at it twice, and then the markets fell.
And by it, he means rates.
Increase. So he used this expression twice, and it just means that the Fed is going to stay the course and probably continue to raise interest rates. It's actually a reference to the 1970s chair, Volcker, chair of the Fed in the 1970s, where the Fed messed up. And Volcker's memoir was called Keeping at It. It was published a year before he passed away, as it happens. But in Keeping at It, I mean, what is he saying? Well, the markets responded by dropping 3 to 4%. So I think it was 3.4% in the case of the S&P 500 and 3.9% for the Nasdaq Composite. So essentially what Jerome Powell's saying is that they're going to stay the course. They're not going to ease up anytime soon. And the markets reacted by dropping 4%. Meanwhile, in crypto, similar drop. It was actually going quite well until Friday. And then most of crypto has dropped, let's say, 5 to 7% over the last week. And that was this week in crypto and the markets.
I thought, because I keep getting these alerts though, that Ethereum had dropped a lot more.
Ethereum is down in the last day. It's down nearly 8%. So just as a quick sense check, where are we on prices? Ethereum is $1,500 and Bitcoin is leveling off at about $20,000.
So crazy enough, since the 14th of August, Ethereum's down 25%. It's weird, like drops like that used to make people like, oh, you're down almost 30%. And actually, I think people are just like, it's all dead. No,
I mean, you get punch drunk, but also it's tracking the stock market sort of scarily closely.
Like an options.
So
it's like stock market leverage.
The 4% drop that we saw on Friday in the stock market was the biggest since June.
Really?
Yeah.
So since 14th of August, Bitcoin is down 20%, 19%. Okay, that's fair enough. Do you think inflation's going to keep going up?
Well, the answer is yes. Because you can't raise the price of gas, which is, and oil, which is the juice that drives the whole economy and brings all the food to us. And you can't then raise the price of all food because of that, also driven by fertilizer and phosphate prices, without driving massive inflation. And as we head into Northern Hemisphere winter, gas prices going up week on week and being very volatile as well, that is going to drive massive inflation.
Do you really think that you can solve this inflation problem through central banking alone?
It's the only lever we have. Do you have any other ideas?
It's my question. You
It's the only. So the answer is it's the only lever we have.
really?
Yeah.
There's no other levers. So what do you think the causes of inflation are? Of bits. Okay, there's many. Right.
Well,
It feels weird that there's like so many causes and the only lever is what they say at Jackson Hole when they're not skiing. And they're like a weird, doesn't it feel a bit weird? Like there's no other problem in this world where that would be like a normal answer. It's like all these things contribute to climate change. The only answer is this one policy lever. We just have to keep, it's on full, but we're just going to leave it on full for a bit longer.
The trouble is that you're asking people who are holding a hammer. Everything looks like a nail. There isn't anything else that you can do if you're a government. I mean, I guess
it's kind of weird though,
what
isn't
you
it?
could do is you could go and talk to your friends at OPEC, or you could go and negotiate somehow about grain leaving the Black Sea, or pushing more gas through Nord Stream 1, or you could accelerate the production of Nord Stream 2, or you could do the unthinkable and make some shocking concessions relating to Ukraine. But those are all...
But that assumes that everything at the moment that we're seeing in inflation is Ukraine related. We were seeing inflation before then. So...
Well, yes, I mean, but that's inflation that's driven by other things.
Well, that's the thing though, isn't it? Because if you think, and this is just my list, not an official list, but like COVID had its own supply chain shock. The whole world was on pause. Then a lot of people, counter to what a lot of people on like crypto Twitter seem to think that during the pandemic, everyone was on like a mad spending spree, when actually the majority of people just accumulated savings or paid off debt during COVID because they had nothing else to do and they had less outgoings because there's less to spend on. We have poor supply chain infrastructure, which doesn't really help. We have a reliance on China for manufacturing, and now China is obviously a bottleneck and also politically a bit sensitive. We haven't been shifting to renewables or other forms of electrification for everything. The Ukraine war has obviously exacerbated that. And then you've got in Europe a reliance on Russia. But in the US, there's a whole load of preceding things that happened with like huge, if you go back to the Trump administration, massive tax cuts pushed, which was all funded by deficit spending, right? Then you've got stimulus checks, again, putting more money into people's pockets during COVID. Then you've got further stimulus from Biden, further investment. I just wonder, like, if the only thing the whole world is waiting on is what Jerome Powell at the Fed says to solve the entire world's problems, then we're royally effed. There's like no, there's got to be something better than that. Obviously, the solution in the UK is for the Prime Minister to go on holiday and for us to basically piss around for a few months. But for the rest of the world, I don't know. We should be doing something else.
I guess the thing that Jerome never says is, I want to raise interest rates so that I can reduce the US's exposure on its national debt, having printed so much money. So,
well, surely what they really want to do, actually, no, they're fine. Because the really interesting thing about the US's national debt is because it's all denominated in dollars, and the Dixie is like at its all-time high right now, where the dollar is just basically crushing all of the currencies. They're kind of fine because people are having to buy dollars to repay back way more relative to their local currency than they had borrowed, and people's reserve currency is still dollars and US bonds. So dollar hegemony is what they're really going for, and it's the thing that I think they need to survive all of this. And inflation is kind of ideal because as you inflate things away, you're also kind of inflating away your national debt.
I mean, that's
everything else. So
that's why this
there's
all
a
makes
kind
sense.
of weird.
Keep
it going, but don't let it fall out of control.
That's why we have the double speak. So when you have Jackson Hole announcements, the subtext is all, this is very carefully worded. lots of that sort of hidden messages, as per the memoir. But the thing that you can't say is, if we hold this course and we keep interest rates high for a while, that makes the US stronger because it fritters away our national debt.
Yeah, you definitely can't say that.
The markets think that the US interest rate in the first half of next year is going to be between 3.75 and 4%.
Base rate.
Yeah, the Fed's target rate.
My dad used to talk about this a lot, about how high it was in the like 70s and 80s.
If you look at a chart of the
and
UK's interest rate, it's like between 7 and 14% has been for decades, for 3 decades, that has been roughly where you expected the Bank of England's interest rate to be.
I suspect okay, now this is off the cuff, but I think what people want, and by people I mean like kind of political elites in every government and central bank, is they want inflation to hover around sort of like 5-6%. People get comfortable with it. They'd been under the 2% target for so long, forgetting that actually what was inflating was education, cost of healthcare, and assets and houses. And now they're like, oh, people are really shocked, and you don't want to get in a cycle where people, it's like the wage price spiral of everyone thinking there's going to be more inflation. It just drives it like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If they can get everyone comfortable with a 5% rate of inflation, everyone is happy. They can keep printing money.
So that was this week in crypto and the markets.
That became a lot more depressing than I thought it would be. Can we move on to a crypto-centric topic?
Talk to me.
So Nick, who is a regular listener to this podcast, sent me through an episode. It's a series now that the FT is doing as a podcast series, which is a skeptical take on crypto. And
thank you, FT.
The FT's always been quite skeptical on crypto, but
Absolutely.
It's well researched and quite nicely nuanced. It's not just the typical kind of, how like Elizabeth Warren just spouts stuff she has no idea about crypto, and it just sounds really just stupid. When
her whipping boy was the banks, I liked it a lot.
But she was a lot closer to the banks, right? In terms of she understood the history of it all, and with crypto, it's just like she's just copy, paste, or find replace, just put the word crypto in to replace the banks, and it hasn't really worked to her favour. But the FT, I think, has some more nuanced takes. They interview a few different people, and they have a skeptical view on crypto, which is quite fair, to be honest, about it being more Ponzi-nomics, kind of a get rich quick mentality, and that it's actually the lack of regulation in that space has really burned a lot of people, especially you think like Terra Luna and stuff, because we talked about stable coins and algorithmic stable coins and Luna like the week before it disappeared. And at that point, I was explaining to Nick that it woke me up because I had not known enough about it, even after doing research for the pod. I still didn't see the risks. Unfortunately, it wasn't exposed, and I think on the pod we discussed like it wouldn't be something we would ever put a lot of exposure to because we didn't understand it, but that there was a viable need for different types of stable coins. And now I'm thinking, oh, that was a bullet dodged. But it made me think we should probably talk a bit about the utility of crypto and whether actually we can critically examine whether any of the stuff that we enjoy and use crypto for actually needs the underlying technology, if it kind of is just branding and rhetoric.
And a Ponzi scheme.
And a Ponzi
You're
scheme.
basically asking the question, is crypto a Ponzi scheme? Let's address that.
I'm asking what's the utility side that means it's not a Ponzi scheme?
Really good. Let's go.
So I think we could split this into a few different areas because obviously, if you just lump everything in crypto into the same thing, it's hard. But if we start with maybe DeFi and then look at NFTs, I think it'd be good. And then if we have time, there's like online identity and governance and other things. But I think Bitcoin and Ethereum, which is probably what we can only talk with confidence about, can you do DeFi? Can you do the stuff in DeFi just using traditional finance without any of the elements that Bitcoin and Ethereum do.
Right. Okay. I mean, you don't want to start bigger by saying, would it be useful to have a decentralized Turing complete computer that no one can shut down? Because you're asking a utility question. So in the Ponzi-nomics side of things, like if you can demonstrate
down
that
that
it
road.
might be a good idea to have a decentralized Turing complete computer that no one can shut down, that just does stuff if you feed it gas, then, and it is, impossible to rig, theoretically impossible to corrupt, that you can't roll stuff back once it's done it, where smart contracts are the ultimate objective arbiter and things just work and happen as they're supposed to be coded.
I feel like that's quite. The thing is, that's quite a loaded place to start from. But let's try it. So, current internet and computing versus decentralized Turing complete computer. Like, what does that mean? Break it down as to why that is what it is and why it's
if
useful.
you want something to be computed for you, by computed, I think what we mean is there is some code. So think of it like a robot. And when you tell it to do something, it does it. Currently, if you want that to happen, your options are you can go to Microsoft for their Azure cloud service, go to Amazon for Amazon Web Services, we can go to Google.
I challenge that. I can go on my laptop.
Well, you
Pro
can-
that's right in front of me.
You can host your own server,
Yeah.
but you won't be able to do that at scale if the robot you're trying to build is going to have any chance of being a successful at scale business or service. Can't keep hosting things out of your garage.
I think a different way of looking at this is about trust. So, what's the value of a trustless system for computing and for the internet? I think that's like the way I would look at Ethereum in particular. With Web 2, everything I use it involves me trusting certain people. I have to trust AWS or Google or Facebook or who's hosting the server or my government or whatever, or the internet service provider. I have to trust all these different intermediaries to basically manage a service, whether that service is just the computer or the actual systems running on it and the applications. And even to manage my identity and my account and my money and everything that I do. And sometimes that's great. In fact, in many cases, it's fine. It's kind of how we've run things up until now. I'm going to kind of paint a picture of the story, and this might not be fully factually accurate, so stop me if I get it wrong, but I think the whole build-up of the internet kind of followed the same pattern with globalization, where we ended up with giant companies spanning, multinationals, essentially, that instead of controlling resources of land and trade and raw materials, controlled the infrastructure of the internet and have the power of nation states and the user base of a nation state and the money in some cases of a nation state. And that's kind of been fine through this period of friendly globalization, free movement, everyone's happy, everyone's a happy camper, we're all kind of growing together. We're now at a point where we're starting to get a bit skeptical about, how much data Google has, how much they influence our behavior, how much control they should have over what we do, and whether people like Facebook should really be the arbiters of conversation and influence our politics and even influence our friendship groups and things we do online, and whether they should actually be the people who control our data and our identities. And in the cases like, Google, Facebook, and maybe even I can put Apple into that, like whether they should really be the controllers of our financial agency. And I feel like Ethereum, Bitcoin, crypto assets in general are a way of saying, actually, you want a way of removing the trust we have to place in all those organizations, because we're starting to get to a point where the happy medium of just putting everything in these big, friendly, big tech companies isn't something we're comfortable with, then you need to move to a form of technology that puts you, the user, in control. And the only way is through a decentralized, Turing-complete computer that is not hosted in one place, not owned by any one individual, and where you actually have the keys to access it and control it. And people who build stuff on it, it is built for everyone. No matter what country you live in or what you might want to say or do, it's for everyone. And it's whether we're comfortable with that and whether there's utility in that. Because, yeah, you could do everything that you can do that we talk about through Facebook, through Google, through AWS, through, government-run organizations. But I don't know if that's
I think
valuable.
the unfortunate truth is that for most people, most of the time, to skip to the end, we're going to find that people prefer intermediaries to looking after their own keys, and people prefer intermediaries to put out a brand that they can trust in and make them feel warm and cuddly, rather than this other thing where a lot more of the responsibility and the legwork of jumping through the hoops to be their own bank, for example, happens themselves. So that might be where we end up. But yeah, I think the story you're telling is the right one as to, in principle, why is this thing supposed to exist?
I guess bigger question. I don't think, given what we've talked about, that it's fair to call things like Bitcoin and Ethereum Ponzi's. Definitely there are other things that are Ponzi's in the whole space that are scams, but they're not founded on the principle that people have to get in it for it to mean something. Like, it actually has a utility. The bigger question is that utility worth $200 billion or $400 billion? It's a network. I mean, I don't know what the market cap of Bitcoin is right now. Or Ethereum actually would be a better example. 183 billion. So is Ethereum, as a global computing network that's fully trustless and decentralized, is it worth 183 billion? Or should it be
413 in the case of Bitcoin?
Yeah. And when compare that to something like, I don't know, let's take AWS as an example, like over $1 trillion, Amazon's market cap. And I think the AWS portion is probably like close to half of that, right? So you've got to ask the question of, like, does this have that value? Because if it doesn't, we'll quickly find that the true, real market value of a decentralized computer is that there's 100,000 people around the world who want to use it because it's decentralized and it has all the things we talked about. And actually, the value of that is 20 million. And maybe that's what it will boil down to in the long run. Or are we going to find a future where actually the true value of a global decentralized trustless computer that everyone can use is 20 trillion, because it's literally the foundation of which everything else gets built on in a future version of a global internet, which doesn't rely on sovereign nation states and big tech giants. Who knows? I guess that's the question.
I mean, asking market cap questions is quite good. I like that. I mean, the market cap of Amazon, is basically 3 times that of Bitcoin right now. Right. And Amazon is definitely more than 3 times better than Bitcoin. It's more useful. It's doing a lot. It's got all the different parts to it. It's got the AWS part. It's got the marketplace part. It's got fulfilled by Amazon.
It doesn't use as much energy.
So, but then the problem with market cap, as any watcher of Tesla will know, and Bed Bath & Beyond, is that it's not really value-based investing anymore. We're not there right now. It's all narratives. So,
but the narrative is key, right? Because crypto is, at the moment, purely speculative, right? But then a lot of assets have this speculative part. So Tesla's a good example, right? But I think you can start to think of it in terms of, is that utility that it provides, which I would argue is a sound utility, but is it actually valuable? Because like VPNs do a fantastic thing of, giving you privacy online, securing your use of the internet. VPNs are like what, $4 or $5 a month for a user. They're not, they're not to the level of crypto where we're suddenly saying, okay, this piece of tech is way bigger, better, more powerful than like a VPN provider. There's a kind of
Yeah, I've got a horrible feeling that the analogy here is that crypto is the telco utilities and the wireless carriers. The Sprints of the noughties and early tens, thinking to themselves, "We're great because we're the future of mobile at the time." And in fact, all the value is in the customer relationship. So Bitcoin and Ethereum are just the dumb pipes; they're just the tubes, and they aren't really worth a market cap of very much. The real value comes to have a relationship with the end user, which might be where some of the Web 2 giants continue to...
Or just decentralized applications built on them, right?
Mm.
So that is DYDX, Uniswap, all these protocols that are built on, the banks built on Ethereum essentially, or the apps built on Ethereum, are those worth more than Ethereum? There's been a big debate in the Ethereum space for a while. And we don't know an answer because it's too new.
Now, has Tether pushed back against the US Treasury's sanction list, also known as OFAC?
Did you see that?
I did not. What have they said?
So everyone else literally bent over backwards to go above and beyond what OFAC had asked for. So USDC in particular, who's run by Circle, one of the main and most reputable US dollar stablecoins, I think it's fair to say, they started sanctioning addresses and blacklisting certain addresses that had interacted with it, or not interacted with Tornado Cash, but were listed as wallets on the Tornado Cash side, so the pools that they were using. Tether responded with a really interesting thing. I'm going to find... Oh, here we go. So Tether said that it hadn't blocked any secondary market addresses nor received any guidance from OFAC to freeze any addresses. Tether is not a US person, nor does it operate in the United States or onboard US persons as customers. And that and it was interesting, they made a really good argument, which is that unilaterally freezing secondary market addresses could be highly disruptive and reckless. And I think what they also had stated is that usually when they've complied with US regulators, they have been told not to randomly freeze addresses because it could impact investigations and it could trigger criminal activity that they're being looked at and they'll behave differently. So it's quite interesting. They kind of they basically push back on all of this.
Are they regarding themselves as a Bahamas-based entity because of Deltec Bank and the Bahamas Bank Capital Union? Are they operating as if?
I don't think they're basically saying like we're outside of US jurisdiction in that sense. They've said that they work closely with law enforcement worldwide to assist in investigations, including freezing addresses. But they said when Tether receives an applicable legitimate request from a verified law enforcement agent to freeze a privately held wallet, the company complies with the freeze. So far, OFAC has not indicated that a stablecoin issuer is expected to freeze secondary market addresses that are published on OFAC's SDN list, or that are operated by persons and entities that have been sanctioned by OFAC. Further, no US law enforcement agency or regulator has made such a request, despite our near daily contact with the US law enforcement, whose requests always provide precise details.
But isn't that exactly what they were requested to do? But on the SDN list, by adding Tornado Cash and the 40 addresses that Tornado Cash employs onto the SDN list, isn't that exactly what Tether was required to do? Was to block those addresses?
They're saying that they've not been told that that's what they're meant to do, and that they've asked and they've received no details. So it's interesting. But it's interesting, this is their claim. So unilaterally freezing secondary market addresses could be highly disruptive and reckless. Even if Tether recognizes suspicious activities on such an address, completing a freeze without the verified instruction of law enforcement and other government agencies might interfere with ongoing and sophisticated law enforcement investigations. In fact, in our dealings with law enforcement, we are sometimes made aware of addresses potentially related to crime and are specifically instructed not to freeze those addresses without the explicit request from the law enforcement, as this could alert suspects of the law enforcement investigation, cause liquidations or abandonment of funds, and jeopardize further connections that might have been established.
Sure.
It's like a really
It's interesting, isn't it? It's almost as if they're
cleverly
saying, okay, Treasury, but you know that this isn't actually how it's done.
right.
Yeah.
Like you don't just basically put out some random spontaneous guidance on a Monday and everyone just interpret to their own delights what they do with it and who they should censor and block and whatever. They've actually,
That's interesting.
for Tether, this is actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, great press release.
Yes, it is time for This Week in NFTs.
This week in NFTs. So Pudgy Penguin's been busy. I actually haven't followed this story. So what has Pudgy Penguin been doing in the NFT space?
It's a funny story, and you don't own a Pudgy Penguin. I don't own a Pudgy Penguin. They look like any of these NFT projects, like little cute animals. So it's loads of penguins. It was a really big project. They're supported by 10KTF. Wagmi-san crafts things for Pudgy Penguins, and they were really big in 2021. Not quite as big as Bored Ape Yacht Club, but I think their prices were going up to like 4 or 5 ETH at some point, which is a lot. There's 8,888, and they had this situation where like the founders suddenly withdrew loads of money from the project fund, and everyone went, "Oh my god, it's a rug pull!" And then the founders were like, "No, it's not that it's a rug pull. We're just kind of bored. Like we set up a project. We thought it'd be fun. This isn't what I want my life to be." I think the founders, I don't know whether you think it's fair or not, but they're in their like 20s and 30s. NFT movement's happening. They get this project going. It's these cute little penguins, and it becomes massive. And suddenly, their responsibility goes through the roof, and they're like, "I kind of wanted to do other stuff with my life."
Right.
So they don't just disappear and go anonymous. They try and sell it. And one of the people from the community offers the money to essentially buy the IP, buy the project off them, right? So even though the founders they have past behavior with other projects and things, so it's not like they weren't known. They were known. People wanted to maintain the project. Someone else wanted to buy it, and so they bought it for I think
750 ETH.
So
this
$2.5 million basically.
Luca Schnetzler.
Yeah, so he bought it for $2.5 million, and then the community has kind of had this big comeback story where it turns out, and this is why I wanted to bring it up, the power of community and activity and belief in a sense of being a penguin has kind of brought them back into this mainstream where they now are really way more close-knit than they were before. They've kind of been, the energy's been reignited behind a new group of people who are managing and leading it and managing the fund and determining the future of this weird project.
Yeah, and on Monday, the rarest Pudgy Penguin.
Well, that's looking in the news.
Sold for 400 ETH.
It's just a penguin with a green background, but I don't know why that makes it rare. But it's kind of crazy because
just under $650,000.
It's an interesting story, right? Of what NFTs actually
looking in a different
are.
direction to the other penguins.
Is that why?
Yeah, that's why it's rare.
Oh, the only one looking at
Yeah.
Okay. Is that an accident? Who knows? But it made me think because NFTs by themselves can people don't understand them, and it's still difficult to really place a value on a kind of a picture. But when you think of it as part of a community, this is a really interesting example where it turns out community is the only thing that's valuable, and everyone getting behind this new leadership and the new movement of these little penguins seems to have given it some redemption.
Yeah.
Can we revisit the metaverse stuff?
Yes, and how more fitting than, because a week ago, last Friday, we didn't talk about it, but Mark Zuckerberg did that tweet of himself in front of the Horizon Worlds, because Horizon Worlds now available in France and Spain. So he did a really bad sort of in metaverse selfie, as it were, where it's his avatar in front of a crude small model of the Eiffel Tower and the Sagrada Familia from Barcelona to mark the fact that it's launching. And in that his avatar is so bad. The eyes in particular, it's just so crude. It's worse than Second Life. It's embarrassing. It's like very hack. And he got a lot of slack. He got a lot of. That's why we don't do that.
Hard to see the
Yeah.
angle. It's so funny. But
And then he later apologized, saying, "Sorry, I did that quite quickly, and
rushed selfies, they're terrible.
we're really working on
Sometimes you're blinking in the
improving
photo.
the graphics in Horizon Worlds. It's going to get better." Also,
I don't think
announcement.
graphics is the problem.
There's an announcement just yesterday or maybe today, I think, that there's been a teasered next version of the Oculus Rift, and that is expected to come out. He said that it's going to have not just eye tracking, but also facial expression tracking
That will not help them.
to create a kind of social presence. And he says that what's really the unlock here is that it makes you genuinely feel like you're in the room with the person in a way that having a Zoom conversation can't. So Facebook's Meta doubling down on the metaverse, very relevant that we're asking what actually is the metaverse right now.
Someone responded to his tweet saying, with it in caption saying, "In Fortnite, you can be Goku with a shotgun." And then someone else. Huh?
I don't get the reference. I'm going to pretend to laugh.
It's in you can the skins you can have.
Yeah.
Like where you can not be. Well, and this is way better. But and someone else put a screenshot of first look at Horizon's world at launch. First look at Yuga Labs Meta other side metaverse with like 4,500 people running around in that thing, and it's which is kind of. I'm actually blown away by how crap it is. Maybe the selfie doesn't do it justice. I've not been in Horizon.
Well, I don't think that clip art version of Eiffel Tower is meant to be representative of all of France when you're in Horizon Worlds. Like, it's just a model that they put in that they got from the internet or something.
Like I've used my Oculus and I've been in like VR chat, and there's been better stuff than that.
The clipping at the
feels
bottom
really-
of the model is wrong as well. It's just a badly assembled 3D model.
But maybe now's a good time to like let's just revisit it, because a while ago, it seems like forever ago, we spoke about metaverse in terms of what it is, what it isn't, our own definitions of it. Has that changed? Has yours changed?
We've got a clearer picture now of what it is, could be, and should be.
The Eiffel Tower with some sort of like.
So first of all, let's say what the metaverse isn't. The metaverse is not one monolithic virtual world. Even for Facebook, it's multiple metaverses that you can be in, multiple virtual worlds. What should the metaverse be, and why does Web3 and metaverse always happen in the same breath? It should be a thing where you get to have property, and now you have a stake. Because the thing that you own, which can only exist digitally, which is a Web3 object, it's through NFTs, that thing can travel from one virtual world to another. And in all circumstances, it continues to be your property.
Yeah.
And that thing might be money, currency tokens, recognition, honor, status, or it might be an object, a sword, a hat, some clothes, your avatar itself. And that is all the metaverse is. That's kind of literally all it is right now, because no one else knows what the other stuff is that's going to come up around the sides of that. But if you can imagine that's the scaffolding, that's kind of all we know it is. And then around that, cultural and social things will happen and value will accrue.
It's digital property.
Yeah,
At
but
its
the thing
core.
is about digital property is that it's meaningless because you can only ever see it on screens. And the idea is that if there is a better interface that might involve a headset, or it might involve using your screen more, then the thing that at the moment just looks like a terrible JPEG of a mutated monkey or ape, or at the moment just looks like a JPEG of some very blocky sneakers, trainers, shoes, that JPEG will stop being just a flat JPEG. It will come to life and it will have a shared community of meaning, because things only have value and meaningfulness when they exist within social form of exchange. And the metaverse is a place where flat, lame 2D images and JPEGs turn into 3D and get given shared meanings?
I'm going to take this full circle and go back to our utility question, because I think the only way you can do digital property, shared digital property across an open metaverse, is through a trustless, true and complete internet computer. I don't think you can do it if you're Facebook, Google, anyone else, because
You could do it through a JV.
Mm.
Do it through a commercial partnership.
a partnership with everyone on the planet.
No, you just have selective agreements with other companies who have licensed you their IP for an object. So the Facebook Bandai partnership would involve your IP of Power Rangers being able to be used within Horizon Worlds. Done. Easy. And then you can API into other services. There is a way of doing it. It's just, it takes a long time to set up the commercial agreements, and nobody ever owns that thing.
So, but then you never have digital property. That's the thing. I don't think you can have digital property if you don't own it. It's kind of the nature of how property works, right? It's not.
Yeah, you'd be perpetually a digital lessor.
Right. Like, I don't know, it feels like,
You're a tenant. You're not a freeholder. You're a leaseholder.
yeah, it's the difference between me going to a bookstore and me buying a book and me downloading a Kindle book.
Yeah,
Like,
or going to what's known as a library, Jonathan. That's how you extend that analogy.
No, because I didn't realize, but digital libraries are going through a problem at the moment where public libraries have the public physical book. They buy the book, they can lend it out a million times. The digital public libraries also have a digital interface where you can borrow books, but they don't work in the same way. They have licensing fees. They never own the digital thing to then do it. They pay huge fees on it, and it's really hard for them to essentially achieve the whole, we're a public library, you can borrow books from us. Meanwhile, what are they called? The Internet Archive is just scraping real physical books, putting it on the internet and going, ta-da, you can just borrow this instead. And people are going, what? You haven't licensed that off me. There's a big, there's a thing about digital stuff where it's really unclear, who owns what and whether you have this because you have the file, but then you can copy the file. And I think this is the difference. You get into the metaverse and you say, I really own this book. There's only one of it. Or maybe there's 100 copies of it or something, but I own one of the 100 copies. And I can lend it to you. And when I lend it to you, you borrow it and it comes out of my wallet and it goes into your wallet. And you have to pay me back because after 100 days, it automatically will come back anyway. And you'll be charged, or if you don't, you'll be charged late fee, or whatever. You can have that smart contract done in a digital setting. And sure, I can take pictures of it and put those on the thing, but it's not the same as having the book. You know what I mean? There's a kind of
Uniqueness.
digital property.
Uniqueness, authenticity, ownership, property being restored to a digital universe where classically, as Andy Warhol pointed out, mass production made everything no longer unique and authentic. But we're able, and digital made that even worse because it was totally frictionless and endlessly reproducible, perfectly, with no errors and flaws. So, yes, restoring uniqueness to a world of perfect copies.
And I think the metaverse now, I would split it into two conversations. One is your point, which is, I think, the better point around property, digital property. The other is how do you render a space where you can engage with whatever it is that you have, your digital property. And that's the bit where Horizon Worlds and the other side and Decentraland and the Sandbox, and there's this, what is it? The World Wide Web, 2Bs, the one Rebits have just integrated with it. There's a whole load of the 2D, looks like Animal Crossing. There's loads of these different game type spaces where you can bring your different objects into them and they'll look different in each different world. I feel like that's a different thing, but it's the layer on top of the actual metaverse, which is your property bit. And then it's about graphics and visual representations and user concurrency,
Yeah. Do you have to actually believe in that second one? Because a lot of people look at VR, look at screen time, look at, what is the trend? The secular trend in screen time is we started with telegrams, then went to radio, then went to TV, then went to colour TV, then went to bigger screens, then went to mobile screens, desktop screens, and now just screens and screens and screens and screens. And they're telling us to now put the screens right up close to our eyeballs.
And your brain.
stop being able to move around for most of the time, unless it's AR. But most of the time, literally, you can't even move around now, because otherwise you just bump into stuff, unless you're on a multi-directional treadmill. So that has been the trend. Well, that has been the trend. But a lot of people would say, no, it's horrible. I'm not doing that. And neither is anyone else going to do that, realistically, unless the world becomes a dystopian apocalyptosphere. We aren't going to be doing that. That we have reached a natural threshold in the amount of screen time it's possible for a person to have and still be healthy and emotionally balanced and mentally healthy. Is the pushback?
I don't think that's ever going to stop people. We've reached a threshold of how many calories we actually need to survive, and yet we still get really fat and unhealthy. Like,
my point being, can you have metaverse layer 1 without having to believe in the environment that you create to bring that stuff to life? And metaverse layer 1, according to you, is just like the foundational idea of property being yours, digital property being yours.
But metaverse layer 2, as you put it, is like, it's not. There's many incarnations of it. So to take 10 KTF as an example, you barely need to look at a screen. You basically enter these missions with your avatars and your things that you like dress up to do certain stuff. And there's engagement through chats on Discord or clicking on Twitter to see the cool story that's evolving. And your participation is pretty much a couple minutes, isn't it? Every week, really, if you're really thinking about it. You have to pay attention to the story, but you're not like just glued to a screen all the time. Versus the other side, which sounds like it's going to be more like Fortnite, where Fortnite has 3 million concurrent users at any one time globally.
Unthinkable.
Yeah, but they're all in like different 100-person fight to the finish games, right? Or they're at a concert where there's a few thousand. The other side, with Improbable, are trying to get to the point where they have 10,000 plus concurrent users in any one of the 200,000 other side plots, right? So they're thinking scale. Those are going to be more immersive, but I don't think we're at a point where people are shying away from that type of screen time. I think that screen time is becoming maybe more normalized, and then the screen time we need to get away from is kind of I'm staring at my phone to like, which is perpetual. So like, I'm spending an hour, I'm going to this weird world, and I'm literally plugging in.
Yes,
doing all my
I'm
stuff,
in an immersive experience rather than
my entire world is.
I'm stuck looking at a very small rectangle.
My nervousness is actually AR is probably going to be the thing that we get to, where your entire world is going to be through a screen. That's, I think, the inevitable 10-year future that we're getting towards. But these type of metaverse ones, I can imagine. The base layer, the layer 0 or layer 1, whatever you want to call it, is digital property, and I'm pretty wedded to that now. I feel like that's the direction that everyone needs to start getting behind and stop thinking about VR, AR, all these Mark Zuckerberg selfies. Like, these are just distractions away from the real thing, which is, what do we do now that we have the ability to make digital property?
Very good. Jonathan, it's been refreshing to be in the same room as you.
Not as refreshing as this side of the aircon.
I'm cold over here, so I don't know how you've been able to bear it.
Do you fancy some lunch?
Let's get half price lunch. It's half price until next Sunday. Just a fact. I think we have to book.
Doing this again next week here.
So if anyone would like to come to Waterloo and stand
just there,
here, you're very welcome to. It'll be great to see you. And thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Doug.
Excellent pod.
Started during lockdown, needed something to do. They looked at each other, they said, hey, I like talking to you. And so from a garden shed in a box room in